Before I get started, I thought I should say a little bit about me, so here goes. I started calling in the States in 2008, and primarily call English country and American contra dances. I'm pretty well known for positional calling, which I began using in 2017. It's a style that focuses on geography and flow to teach impromptu dances, rather than individual dance roles. In addition to the obvious and intended benefit of being ungendered, which was something I'd already been exploring at the request of dancers and out of personal interest, I discovered that positional teaching helped new dancers understand the structure of the dance more easily and learn faster as a result. As Zoom dancing emerged in the spring of 2020, I quickly discovered that most callers were calling for couples, whereas I was dancing alone and it wasn't much fun. So in July, I started a weekly workshop called Wednesday Walkthroughs, which were intended to take a close look at solo dance choreography adapted or created from the folk tradition. As time went on, I found myself writing more and more dances specifically for Zoom. I had been perusing digitized dance manuals for a while, and had discovered a set of dances written in the first 2 decades of the 18th century for couples by the dancing master Mr. Isaac, who's probably familiar to many of us from the dance Mr. Isaac's Maggot. Although it was slightly orthogonal to the goals of his workshop, Colin gave me some ideas about how I might adapt those dances for Zoom. I was immediately interested in these dances for a variety of reasons. First, I'm a historian by trade and training with some expertise in the 18th century. Second, I'm interested in the way the folk process embraces change as a tradition, and in seeing that manifest itself in choreography. And third, I happen to think the 18th century is a high point aesthetically for English dancing. The artist William Hogarth did too. In this print from his book on beauty, published the year before his death in 1754, he illustrated his famous line of beauty with examples from a ballroom. Although the central image has characteristically satirical elements, the exemplary couple at the top of the hall hold their bodies in such a way as to create this line of beauty in their posture, their joined arms, and the drape of their clothing. The figures of the dance were likewise characterized by this sinuous line of beauty. In the upper left-hand corner of his print, Hogarth includes 2 figures, a hay for 3 and a minuet, in tiny diagrams that refer to a relatively new type of dance notation called foyer, or sometimes foyer-Beauchamp notation, which was originally devised by the French choreographer and dancing master Raoul Auger Foyer in 1700. Publication meant that dances were accessible beyond the court, the first step in a potential folk process, and indeed by 1706 French court dances that were published had begun appearing as entr'acte dances on the stage. Here's an example of foyer notation from a 1704 collection of dances choreographed by Louis-Guillaume Pécourt. As you can see, the lines of movement are augmented by detailed notations of footwork. While we're looking at this book, I also want you to note 3 things. First, that the dances described in it were performed at the opera. Second, that these 2 particular dances were done by 2 women in the first instance, and 2 men in the second. And third, that the figures are very square, in contrast to Hogarth's line of beauty. Pécourt, it turns out, is credited with changing the S shape of the minuet into a Z in order to make it easier for dancers to stay in proper relation to one another. In the 18th century, the definition of beauty was part of a larger nationalistic debate between France and England. We can see that if we look at one of Mr. Isaac's dances. This is the Pastorale, one of the more complicated of Mr. Isaac's 2-couple dances. In the patterns of each figure, we see a lot of curves and loops, and relatively few sharp angles, in contrast to the 2 dances by Pécourt that we were just looking at. Having said that, there was a lot of exchange between the 2 countries in this period. Mr. Isaac himself had been invited to France in 1684 to teach English country dancing, and he brought French influence back with him to England. Unlike in France, where published choreography was soon being written explicitly for the stage, Mr. Isaac's dances were for private balls, although admittedly I'm using the word private loosely, as dances at court were definitely still spectacular events where most of the people in the room were watching rather than dancing most of the time. However, dances were viewed in the round, with people seated around 3 sides of the room, rather than primarily from the front as in a theater. Court dances in England were of 2 sorts, the bal sérieux and the bal ordinaire. The latter was what we might ordinarily consider the purview of social folk dance. They were the country dances where anyone might join in. The bal sérieux, in contrast, was where the formal dances with carefully choreographed footwork and complex relationships between music and figures, like the Pastorale, would be done as a display to demonstrate skill, danced by courtiers or those aspiring to a place at court. They explicitly referenced the French tradition, despite the different setting. Mr. Isaac's dances for 2, or danse à deux, were described in one publication as French dances. in opposition to the English country dances that were known in France as contredanse. Publication was a way to enhance one's reputation and to ensure one's legacy, as is suggested in this portrait of Pécour, where not only is the portrait itself an advertisement for the dance master, but he's depicted holding a published book of dances that likewise advertise and assure his place in history. While Mr. Isaac's portrait doesn't include any attributes beyond his fashionable wig and artificial beauty mark, he too used publication, mostly in collaboration with the publishers John Walsh and John Weaver, to enhance his reputation and assure his legacy. So what are Mr. Isaac's couple dances actually like? I couldn't find historical reconstructions of his dances, but here's a foyer dance done with period footwork. As I thought about adapting these couple dances for country dancers, I had to consider several things. First, I would have to privilege pattern over footwork in order to make the dances accessible. Luckily, as we can see in the Royal Anne, Mr. Isaac's patterns are quite interesting. For example, in the opening figure, which is the large image on the left, there is a weaving line that hopefully reminds you of Hogarth's line of beauty. One thing I've learned as a Zoom choreographer over the past year is that when you're dancing alone or with just a partner, changes of momentum feel incredibly satisfying, as do contrasts between square and round figures. This is quite different from the continuous flow that modern English and contra choreography has increasingly sought over the last 2 decades. But it's an interesting lesson that Hogarth's visual sense of what is beautiful is matched by our somatic or bodily sense of what feels good. Another figure in the Royal Anne particularly intrigued me. If you look on the second row, the middle 2 figures are, roughly speaking, 4 changes of a circular hay, but the dancers are always facing. As I adapted the dance, I began to call this figure Mad Robin Changes, because of that facing quality. In the context of the Playford tradition, it combines the familiar and the unfamiliar, offering us something new that is nonetheless quickly recognizable. In some sense, I hope that by creating a modern adaptation of this dance, I might be introducing this figure into the folk process. I'd love it if other choreographers picked it up and put it in a modern dance. One more thing you can see in the Royal Anne, as you've seen in all the dances I've shown so far, is that the tune is written across the top of the page accompanying the figures. When I first started looking at these dances, I didn't have any easy way to access the tunes, or even understand what they sounded like beyond a vague comprehension of meter. I can read music well enough to follow along, but not to generate it myself without a lot of work. Before I asked anyone to put that much effort in, I thought I'd better figure out if the dances were going to be worthwhile. I collected a dozen dances or so and began working out adaptations that I tested at my Wednesday walkthrough workshops. Apart from retaining setting steps and a step and honor, in some cases, I eliminated all the footwork straight away. I decided to describe the space of the dance in terms of a 3-couple set, because we had become used to imagining that dance space in Zoom. Trying to follow the choreographed pattern reasonably faithfully, I created dances that felt satisfying to me as a solo dancer, but that I ultimately envisioned being danced in person with couples as a new subset of the repertoire. I found existing recordings of tunes that matched the meter of the documented tune, and in some cases the Wednesday walkthrough dancers and I tested multiple tunes with the same choreography. Although it was just a few people, the Wednesday walkthrough dancers were characteristic of what I began to think of as the digital folk process. Cecil Sharp described the folk process as requiring continuity, variety, and selection, a definition that was expanded upon by Maud Karpeles and others. Basically, according to this model, folk music and dance are traditions that reach back in time, exhibit variety due to individual and group inputs, and reflect cultural preferences through an unconscious process of selection that narrows the set. According to this definition, the body of folk songs, tunes, and dances gets smaller over time and changes incrementally. The American musicologist Charles Seeger was apparently the person who coined the term itself, and in contrast to Sharp, whose definition focuses on identifying a folk canon, Seeger was interested in process as the defining characteristic of folk. Folk isn't just something that has a process that brings us to a canon of products, it is a process. For him, folk is always changing, and therefore always new. It is the process by which cultural artifacts are changed, whether minutely or in significant amounts, to form new cultural products. I like this definition because it doesn't constrain us to find justification for changes we make in the documented past. The tradition becomes an inspiration rather than a limitation. And that brings me to the question of need. Neither Sharp nor Seeger offer a motivation for the folk process. In other words, their observations are about how folk works, but not why. But we are all motivated by something, and change in particular most often happens in response to a need. In my case, these reconstructions came about because of the transformation in our dance experience prompted by the pandemic. We went from needing dances for long ways sets to needing dances for just one or two people, but that still use a familiar vocabulary of figures and aesthetics. Many people have observed that the internet has changed the geography of the folk world and the speed of its process. And when we started Zoom dancing, we saw that happen in our bit of the folk world. Dances became international, and as a result, there was a more rapid and diverse exchange of ideas. I hope, we'll see a lasting impact on the social folk dance world as a result. But Zoom dancing also introduced problems. Dances that progressed needed to be adapted, dances that were fun with other people were dreary as a solo dancer. Dancers were frustrated by changes to familiar and beloved choreography, and choreographers weren't always thrilled when callers altered their dances in awkward ways or without asking permission. Turning to these couple dances, I knew I didn't want to create historically accurate reproductions with and for my dancers. Instead, we were going to repurpose them, exploring their 18th century character and translating them into a 21st century context. I began with the dances as notated. Here's the Godolphin, with its delightful dedication to the Lady Harriet Godolphin, later Duchess of Newcastle. The dance appealed to me because of the strong opening hey and the fact that the action happened both across the dance and up and down the center line. Because the pattern was my priority, I worked out the adapted choreography before I selected music. Here's what I came up with. A dance to a square tune, or in other words, 2 8-bar A parts and 2 8-bar B parts, that incorporates the major figures of Mr. Isaac's original, the hey, the cast onto the center line, the shoulders round, and leads forward and back. And then I paired it with a tune. This process was a bit haphazard. I wanted a tune that didn't have extremely familiar existing choreography paired with it, although of course everyone's repertoire is different, so that wasn't always possible. But it's distracting to have one set of figures in one's head when trying to learn another set, so I did my best. And I wanted to match the time period as well as the energy and pace of the dance as I'd adapted it. In the case of the Godolphin, I chose the tune Portabella, and used a recording by Bare Necessities that you'll hear in this video from the Wednesday walkthrough where I first tested it. And close in middle place. Fall back a double. Cross by the right. Cross and cast right. You're on the center line. Forward a double. And back. Left shoulder 3/4. Lots of time for that. Lead down. Fall back and 2-hand turn halfway. Face up and fall back. Lead up the middle. A back down. And close in middle place, fall back. Cross. Cross again and cast right. Onto that center line. Forward a double. Left shoulder around. Face down, lead down. And turn halfway. Face up and fall back. Lead up. All in all, we danced a dozen of these preliminary reconstructions together, and based on the dancers' feedback, I chose several that were worth exploring further. The next step in my mind was to find out more about their original tunes. For that, I enlisted the help of the brilliant and knowledgeable Mollie Koenigsberger, who plays violin and viola, among other things. I photoshopped together the music from each dance and sent her PDFs, and a week later we got together on Zoom for a long discussion, really a lesson for me in Baroque dance music. Here's a taste of our discussion about meter, with apologies to Mollie for the quality of the audio recording.
It's quite a subtle difference, but less subtle when it comes to dance. It's very clear that there are 2 steps to the bar, 2 medium steps to the bar. If it were written in 4-time, that would imply 4 steps to the bar. So
that 2 is really saying something that to me would sound like the downbeat rather than.
I'll try and play you the difference. Now, if you're trying to do 4 steps to the bar, it really can't go any faster than that. Otherwise, your little legs are going to be. But because it says 2, I'm thinking of plod, plod.
Right.
So it's about, for musicians, it's about a feel of how many strong beats are there per bar. But for a dancer, it's how many times it's about the footfall.
As you heard in that snippet, a lot of the conversation was specifically about the expectations that the music set up for how the dance would be done. Mollie played every tune for me, sometimes at more than one tempo, and she often pointed out errors in the transcription, characteristic elements of tunes, and other fascinating bits. After we talked, I used the Zoom recording from our conversation to create new versions of the dances that fit each tune's length and phrasing. By this point, I was looking ahead to the workshop I was to lead in May as part of the Playford Past and Present series, run by the Friends of English Dance, and getting excited about the idea of workshopping these dances with their original tunes. Mollie didn't have the setup for playing on Zoom, but luckily I'd started chatting with Linda Game of the English Contradance Band about the project, and she offered to work with me on them. I sent her the music and Mollie's recordings, and she sent me back MP3s that were the musical equivalents of rough drafts, like this one of the Godolphin. I continued to work on the choreography, and then in April we got together for a couple of weekends, and she played while I danced again and again, both of us making tweaks as we went along, or sometimes big changes, taking out whole figures or phrases of the music, or changing the number of times through each phrase. Tempo was often in question, something made more complicated by the fact that as I adapted the dances, I was removing footwork that would have taken up musical time without necessarily covering a lot of ground, and that would potentially have been done more slowly than modern dancers want to move without it. In fact, in Godolphin, this wasn't as much of a concern. Here's the final track Linda recorded at essentially the same tempo as the rough draft. But listen to the difference in another tune for the Royal Anne. Here's the rough draft. And here's the final version. ultimately, the choreography led us to speed up the tune a fair bit. You'll have noticed that the Royal Anne is in triple time, as are many of Mr. Isaac's dances. The historian Jennifer Thorpe has noted that Mr. Isaac's predilection for triple time, and particularly triple time English hornpipes, was one of the things that distinguish his dances from those of his peers. According to Thorpe, Mr. Isaac's choreography was likewise distinctive for its unorthodox endings, which accompanied a general eccentricity of form and subtle humor. He also transformed French forms into English ones. For example, the Godolphin takes the French entrée grave, which is a theatrical solo dance for a man, and turns it into a ballroom duet. After we'd worked out how the music and dances could go together, Linda recorded the tunes for 12 of them, and also recorded separate sections, A's and B's, for some of the more complex ones, so that I could use them for teaching. In May, I led the first workshop of these dances with the original tunes after winnowing down the set list with the help of my Wednesday walkthrough dancers, who confirmed my suspicions about some iffy choreography, as well as my enthusiasm for some more complex choices. Playford Past and Present is a series for experienced dancers looking for a challenge, and these dances are neither simple nor familiar. Because of that, I made a teaching slideshow for the workshop, which was, of course, on Zoom. In this slide, I mapped the imaginary space of the three-couple set onto the foyer notation used by Mr. Isaac. It isn't always perfect. The notation isn't drawn to scale, for one thing, but it allowed me to convey the idea of the space and the center line that the dancers would be using. In some cases, the adapted dances start at the bottom of the hall, as in the originals, but in others I truncated them so they start and end in middle place. The only other orientation dancers need to know is they have a home side and an improper side. The calls are the same for both dancers in every dance, so it doesn't matter which side a solo dancer chooses. In that workshop, I also noted some style points. For instance, the way that Mr. Isaac created counterpoint between square and round figures, and expected the dancer to do likewise. I encouraged dancers to articulate each figure by arriving firmly before beginning the next, what I call land and launch. And although we weren't doing historic footwork, I suggested that they think about how they're moving, landing with a slight rise and fall, for instance, if it felt good, or simply paying attention to how their footfalls interacted with the music. This adds texture to the dances that can really make them come alive. We're used to square tunes, 4, 8, 12, and 16-bar phrases, but in these dances those are few and far between. For example, the Godolphin has a 7-bar A part and a 10-bar B part, with an extra bar at the end that sounds from the phrasing as though it's between them. The Royal Anne has a 14-bar A part and a 24-bar B, and so I decided that we'd just use AAB, eliminating the second B part. As I said earlier, I hope that these dances will have a life beyond Zoom dancing, and to that end, a small group of Wednesday walkthrough dancers met up in summer 2021 at Pinewoods Camp in Massachusetts to make a video of a couple of the dances in person. Here's the Royal Anne in one of those videos. Huge thanks to Rebekah, Valencia, and Wendy Clarke for being my demo dancers at very short notice. I'm going to let it go through the dance a couple of times. The music is by Linda Game. As you saw, I kept the major figures from the original, the hay at the beginning and the 4 Mad Robin changes in the B part, but it's definitely really different from the historically accurate reconstruction we saw earlier. It's adapted to feel more like a country dance. I don't want to get too far into the weeds of the choreographic details, but several things changed between my first draft versions with borrowed tunes and these final ones. For example, in the Godolphin, which we're about to watch, I adjusted the choreography for the shorter musical phrase in the A part, and in the B, the left shoulder round into a lead down became a more expansive figure because of the longer phrase, adding the set and turn single up so that the lead down becomes a mirror back to back. Here's another video from Pinewoods. You'll hear my call quite loudly, I'm afraid, because I was holding the camera, but the music is once again by Linda Game.
Lead up. Cross. Out to the center, fall back. Left shoulder. And set. Turn up. Flip and fall back. Half figure eight. Cross. Out to the center line and fall back. Left shoulder. And set. Turn up. Back to back down. Face up, fall back. Half figure eight.
I hope I've given you a taste of the mixture of history, present needs, and future enjoyment that drove me to investigate these dances, and that you've enjoyed hearing a little bit about my process. I want to give thanks to the dancers and to Linda Game and Mollie Koenigsberger, without whom I couldn't have done the work, and in terms of thinking about the folk process and the centrality of change to what we do, I'll leave you with this quote from that early conversation I had with Mollie about these tunes.